I just have to share how excited I am about this panel today and how grateful I am that so many of you have interest in this obviously very important topic right now. It is incredibly timely, and I'm very grateful to our panelists, Steve and Ed and Melissa, our moderator today, for taking the time. And Kelly may have said this before I got on, but one of the things we've heard loud and clear in our conversations with and our surveys of senior fellows is there's a keen interest in wanting to not only get to know one another, but to learn from each other. And so we've really been focusing our programming around the concept of really tapping into the incredible skills and talent and knowledge of this amazing network of 700 or so people across the state. So thank you for participating in this. And I'm super grateful, as I said, to our panelists today. And with that, I will turn it over to my lovely classmate who I adore, Melissa Navas. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'm really glad to be here with everyone. I might be, well, outside of Beth, who's tuning in from Tacoma, I might be the only ALF member on this call that's not in Oregon right now. I moved away from the state about 3 years ago to move to Chicago. But I consider Oregon home. I spent my first kind of half of my life in Oregon, or my time in Oregon working at the Oregonian, and covered K-12 education, covered health. And I think the thing that I was probably most proud of when I was there is doing some work investigating teachers who sexually abuse their students, and how local school districts and states were basically covering things up and allowing these teachers to move about the state or to other states to teach. I moved into government, so I worked for Multnomah County in the communications office, and it was a chance to experience public service in a different way. And then in 2014, I went to Governor Kitzhaber's office to serve as press secretary, which was, unbeknownst to me, right before things just got really interesting in the office, to say the least. I worked with him for his remaining time in office before he resigned, and then ended up serving Governor Brown for a couple more years after that before I ended up going to Chicago. So anyhow, that is my story. I'm so grateful to be here and to actually have a conversation and not just us talking at you about this topic. I want to introduce our panelists, Steve Forrester, ALF Class 3. Steve's family business has been community newspapers in small towns across Oregon and Washington, Pendleton, Astoria, EO Media, as it's now called, as preserved through economic highs and lows, changing technologies, wildfires, plus the Great Astoria Fire of 1923, and so much more. Through these changes, their newspapers kept course and stayed afloat during traditional reporting, editing, and sound family business planning. And next we have Ed Madison, who's part of Class 34. Ed's career in media began at the age of 16, coordinating talent for a Washington, D.C. talk show. He has since produced and directed programs and segments worldwide for television, film, and commercial projects. He was a founding producer at CNN, and he's now at the University of Oregon, where Ed teaches media innovation, multimedia journalism, and documentary filmmaking, and authored, among other works, Newsworthy, Cultivating Critical Thinkers, Readers, and Writers in Language Arts Classrooms. So to start, instead of me asking just the questions that I might think are interesting or the things that the panelists want to talk about, I actually wanted to open it up to all of the other senior fellows on the call. You joined because you were interested in this topic, but I actually wanted to hear a little bit more from some of you about what it is you're hoping to get into further discussion about, and either in the questions that I ask or in the responses that Steve and Ed give, we'll want to try and weave some of that in so that this is truly a conversation that is built by you. So if anybody wants to unmute and just raise your hand and say, I'm gonna actually just take some notes here. So feel free to just drop in things that you are wondering things that are confusing right now. You know, we're dealing with a pandemic, wildfires, racial reckoning across the country and world. You know, there's a lot of information that's coming at us and in Oregon about a lot of things. So if anybody just wants to jump in and start, that would be great. Yes. Oh, and if you can just say, for the other classmates who don't know, if you can just say your first name and your class, and then launch into your class.
Tom, class 1. For Steve and Ed, there is so much confusion, I'll use the term carefully, in the press right now about what is real and what is not. How do people like me who rely on public information like public radio in newspapers and other sources to be able to winnow in on what actually is factual and what I should be paying attention to?
Thank you. That's great, Tom. Anyone else? Yes, Carolyn.
Carolyn, class 10. I live in Grants Pass. We have a small paper which has been in one family for over 100 years. And it's a very good paper. The journalism is excellent. They won 27 prizes in a journalistic thing around the state, second only to the Oregonian. They really look at being good journalists. But it's probably going to fold because there's one senior woman in the family that's very old, and you know, I don't know how to help the paper. And so I'm very interested in this topic because we need journalism that is excellent at all levels, at local levels too. And so I'll be listening keenly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Others with questions, things that they're wondering, things that they're struggling with. Hi, Vicki.
I'm curious about how, when you find something in a local newspaper that bothers you and you want to weigh in, it's often hard to find anyone to write to, or I had an example with the Columbian last week, and after a number of hours, I found the editor's email address, and I wrote him, and he wrote me right back. That was fortunate. But there are other times I can't find anyone to write to, and I just get more and more frustrated. And I don't know if your tips is the only thing you can do is write an editorial letter, or is there another way of finding people to contact?
Okay. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, this is Lou Frederick.
Hi, Lou.
My class calls itself the Forever 29. So, with Alf, I am curious about your looking at the fact that we no longer have a real statewide media presence. You do not have people from the folks in Eugene or even in Medford or in Klamath Falls or Pendleton really are really not known in Portland anymore, and vice versa. That the impact of not having a media that is in fact statewide makes a big difference for legislation. It makes a big difference in terms of talking with people across the state. So I'm curious about your comments on that.
And Lou, when you say statewide media, are you talking about one outlet covering, or are you covering the entire state? Or are you talking about?
No, I'm talking about the fact that the Oregonian has a much smaller footprint than it once had. The broadcast media, the only statewide broadcast media is really OPB, because the television stations and other radio stations no longer go out to the rest of the state unless it's a disaster of some form. There's not a regular coverage of what's going on in Klamath Falls or what's going on in Coos Bay. People in Portland do not know that. The people in Coos Bay only hear the most outrageous, not outrageous, but the most titillating, if you will, news about what's going on in Portland. I had to tell someone that no, downtown Portland is not burning down, but that's what they were hearing.
Got it. Thanks for the clarification. I also see one question in the comments, so thank you for leaving that.
And Melissa, I think there's 3 in the chat, 3 questions in the chat.
Oh, that is right. Yeah, I see them here.
Just to make sure, yeah.
Yeah, social media messages. What can we as ALF Senior Fellows do? And then the final question. So yes, I do have them all. Well, I think this is a good start. Also, feel free to drop something in the chat box so that I can look to that and pull out questions. And if there's something that a term mentioned or a concept that you just want to pause on and let us talk about that before we move on, you can just raise your hand or go, and then we'll chat. And as much as possible, we can pretend that we're somewhere in the state of Oregon together in a big circle talking about this very important topic. So first, what I wanted to open with is just to hear for Steve and Ed, your take on reliability of media and trust in media. You both have extensive experience in journalism, but if you're looking at just the state of play right now in 2020 with some of the things that I mentioned that are deeply affecting Oregon, what is your sense of trust in media in the state and with the state news outlets? And Ed, I'll start with you.
I think that OPB continues to be, a very trusted and reliable source. Although there are, conservative views that perhaps maybe it leans liberal. Not so much OPB, but NPR, I think would be the sort of sense that many, some people have. The Oregonian, I can't speak to as much. I think obviously they've had severe cutbacks over the last decade, and going to the tabloid, and I'm not sure they're even publishing a daily. It's just had a significant effect. I think the last time I was in that newsroom, maybe 2 years ago, it looked like a ghost town. Most of the desks and chairs were on top of the desk, and it was a skeleton of what it once was, which was an award-winning, major significant daily newspaper. So I think that there's been obviously a considerable shift as it relates to trust. But when I look at this topic, I always start by looking at just in terms of when we talk about news, what are we actually talking about? So for those who are older and grew up on newspapers, there is a very clear delineation between what's news and what's commentary and what's sports, because they're on different pages. Whereas in the cable television space, I don't know that when people are asked, do you trust the media, if they make a distinction between what Lester Holt does and what Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity do. In other words, just and I talk about this in another book that I did, that around the time of sort of the tabloidization of television programming that was adjacent to news, so the hard copies and inside editions and all those types of shows, they co-opt the use of the news desk, and actually Bill O'Reilly was the host of one of those shows, to the extent that people didn't distinguish, this is news and this is infotainment or entertainment. And so I think that that's part of the problem, and one of the reasons that when people are polled, that they say they have such distrust in news, because they're collapsing and really not making distinctions about news and and opinion programming.
Steve, how about from your perspective in your, not only your time in news, your family has a long history of news, working in news in the state. What is the evolution of trust in media as you are seeing it in the communities that EO Media has a presence in?
Well, I think Ed stated very well and very succinctly the what's going on today in terms of the blurring of the lines within cable TV, which is, you know, a way bigger player than we are, of course. But in our communities, we're kind of it, because no one else will come here to cover the school board, et cetera. We don't find that we have any kind of a fake news allegation in our communities. What we measure is the number of subscribers. These days, that of course also includes digital subscribers. And then what we hear in the letters to the editor. The only trend I really could report on, and it happened while I was editor and publisher for about 30 years, is that the phenomenon of people wanting to hide behind their email address or their their fake name, shall we say. And because I was always a firm believer that after the third time I went back and forth with some disgruntled reader, I'd say, why don't we meet and chat in person? And then I had my first encounter with a guy who really didn't want to do that. And so a lot of the world is, as we know, that way right now. But I think Lou Frederick's question really gets at the heart of what's going on in Oregon right now. When the Oregonian began to implode, what I noticed here in Astoria is we knew less about what was going on in Portland. And in response also to what Lou has said, we have, in response to what's going on at the State House, we formed our own State House Bureau. It's a collaborative with Pamplin Media. And we have an arrangement by which we staff it and they staff it. And in all, we have 3 reporters there. And it's a weekly, anyone can get it. It's free. It's a weekly feed on Fridays. And we feed not only to our own subscriber base, but to the subscriber base of 3 or 4 other newspapers. The other factor that's not mentioned typically beyond the Oregonian is what happened to the Eugene Register Guard. It was the Baker family sold it to a hedge fund, Gatehouse Media, which has just eviscerated the newspaper. So we forget about that, but the Guard was arguably Oregon's best newspaper. I mean, the Oregonian was big, and it certainly did have its day too, but consistently the Guard was, and it's gone now, effectively.
Wow.
One of the things that recently came out, and I was spending some time yesterday taking a look at it, was this Pew Research study that the results of it came out. It was a year-long study, came out in August of this year, and it was focused on Americans' trust and attitudes toward the news media. And what I'll do is I'll send these links to Kelly after, or maybe Kelly, if you find them, if you search Pew Research Study in August, there's a thing, but I'll send the link so folks can take a look at it after. But one of the things that the study found was that partisanship is the strongest factor in Americans' views of the news media. And there was another dividing line that they identified, which was support for Donald Trump. And that whether if you were a Republican or a Republican-leaning conservative, independent, I'm sorry, that they cited a desire to mislead audiences as a major reason why significant mistakes make their way into news stories. So just to spend a little bit of time talking about partisanship and how people's perceptions of the information that they're getting might skew what they think about the organization or the reporter that's providing the news. Steve, if we can start with you, if you can just talk about partisanship and how you see that playing out in our consumption of the news, where we choose to get it, and what your take on it is.
Well, I think you have to read broadly. High school teacher told me that ages ago, and he anticipated the time what we live in now. But that's mainly nationally, of course. In towns like we serve, except for Bend, there's no other, full-time news source there. We've on occasion had, aspersions cast at some of our reporters. We take that very seriously, and when it does come up, we look into it, and I really can't remember that we ever changed someone off their beat because of that. But when issues get very hot, that does come out occasionally, but nothing like the national scale of, of aspersions between Fox and CNN and so on and so forth. But you will find people, if you random sample around Astoria or so forth, that will say, we're owned by someone else or whatever our brains are. But I don't think it's a widespread belief.
So you think in some of the smaller communities around the state where EO Media has presence, that critique of partisanship or skewed media organizations is really framing for maybe more national publications or outlets, and not for the publications at EO Media?
Well, yeah, I should elaborate just a little bit, because each one of our papers and so forth is in such a distinct place. Interestingly enough, the Blue Mountain Eagle, which is a weekly we own up in Grant County in John Day, is right now in the midst of probably the most contentious situation of all. Has nothing to do with COVID, which is the big, of course, contentious thing everywhere else. But our reporter took, I don't know how many, about a year, I think, putting this together. Our editor did, I should say, about bad behavior, polite word, bad behavior in the sheriff's department. And it included all the sort of stuff you might think of internally. And it was a very bold piece, and we ran it by lawyers, etc. And there really are two alternate, that's a place where you do have two alternate realities in Grant County: Sheriff Palmer's reality and everyone else's. And so that's sort of, you might say, the big standoff that we know about or deal with. And Grant County is one of those places, the Blue Mountain Eagle is one of those that if we ever walked away from it, it would be a news desert. And we're showing that to people who were trying to interest in investing in various ways in that newspaper, that, if our editor hadn't done this, you wouldn't know what's going on there. So it's sort of, for us, it's situational. Nationally, it's a drumbeat.
Okay. Ed, what are the forces at play with partisanship that you see playing out in how people trust or don't trust their local or state national news sources?
Well, first of all, I think we have to look at historically the notion of quote unquote objectivity in news is a fairly recent phenomena in American journalism. If you were to go back and look at the history of the American press, there've been there's a long tradition of taking sides. Objectivity came as a way to appease advertisers. We're going to not be offensive, or we're going to say, but there's this notion of taking sort of both sides or showing both viewpoints. There are egregious issues related to race and related to all kinds of other things where I don't know what the other side would be, So that's one factor. I also think that we're in a different time politically in terms of what we're seeing with this administration. I mean, if you just look at the front page today, and when you've got, the president making statements that are contradictory to what every, medical professional says is accurate about the dangers of this virus, then is it partisan to say that that's a lie? Or is it, so I think that we're seeing a sort of a heightening of adversarial journalism because it's in response to certainly what cannot be described as anything less than adversarial from some of our highest politicians.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad that you brought up objectivity, because one of the things that I'll notice as I sometimes do this against my own best advice, which is scroll the comment section of a news organization and just start reading. I feel like Lisa's posted about this on Facebook recently. Don't read the comments, but But one of the things that I see is a criticism of the person who is, the reporter who has published the piece is this is not objective. The either the publication or the person themselves is not an objective reporter. Can you just spend a little bit more time, and then I'll be interested in hearing Steve's take on this, of what, when we talk about objectivity, and that word gets thrown around as we talk about news and our ability to trust, what is it that you think is a misconception by everyday news consumers about objectivity, and whether that is achievable, not,
Well,
or is the gold standard of what reporters should be doing?
I think it's an intent to try to apply the scientific method, to journalism, to suggest that, that you can observe and report and write about something, and not inject your own perspective. Now, I think, objectivity is different than bias. We talk really more about fairness in reporting. We talk more about transparency in reporting. And so to know or to acknowledge that you may have a perspective, you might go into reporting a story with a certain perspective, but with an openness to discover what's really there, not try to fulfill your own agenda, is generally the way we would think that news gathering should happen.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, I think we're in times now where we've got things being pulled off of websites, government websites that contradict science, all kinds of censorship and things that are happening that have to be called what they are, which is inaccurate and not true. And that can be perceived as partisan.
Steve, anything to add on to the topic of objectivity?
Yeah. The only thing I would add, Ed stated it very well, is I've always thought, objectivity is unachievable. We all bring something to whatever it is we're looking at. And what we bring is our past, our set of values, our race, our religion, whatever it might be. And to that extent, journalism, it is not a science. There's no provable method for how to do this. So to a certain extent, it is an art. And that gets to really with respect to beyond the question of accuracy or fairness. The biggest choices we make are what we cover. Then it's how we cover it. But, you can sit here in Clatsop County and delude yourself that there's not a significant Hispanic population. And you probably have no idea who they are or what they think. So we chose 25 years ago or something like that. We did a series, it was called Nuestra Vidas, Our Lives. And the Hispanic Council, again, helped us with translations. And it just focused on an array of people in this county. And we're nothing like Eastern Oregon, for instance. We're in Pendleton, like Hermiston, for instance, 50% of the high school student body is Hispanic. So we're much smaller, but it is a factor. It is a big factor in many ways. We chose to look at that. We could easily have avoided looking at that. Now, at the same time, I think we occasionally rightly accused of ignoring some things, and I'm sure we've done that. But it's all in. A lot of it is how you respond to your critics too. We're ignoring it. Okay, tell me more. Who can tell us about this? Mm-hmm. And because over the years, and I think one of the class members was talking about how do I get through to the Columbian, for instance. And regrettably, some newspapers make it very difficult. They seem to hide behind their webpage. We try to be very transparent, phone numbers, the whole thing. Because if you really want the news, if you want to publish the news, you don't know it sitting where you are at. Somebody has to tell you about it. You may observe something, but you're relied on your sources. And in a small town, they're walking by all the time, and it's just a matter of who you choose to listen to and open up to.
When I was a reporter in Hillsborough, this is where I started at the Oregonian, going to school board meetings in Banks and Forest Grove and, you know, the like. We would have people come into the bureau, which was 4 people in an office in downtown Hillsborough, to ask questions about their garbage. How can we help them with, I mean, they really looked at it as if you are a reporter in my community, you're not just doing the news. I think there was an expectation of having access and then also being able to talk about the many things that they were facing and trying to figure out how do you help us?
Yeah.
So at some point I was looking up garbage information for sanitation information for community members.
There was a lot of that. And I often thought in my years as an editor and publisher, I spent a lot of time introducing you to you. You know, she knows what you want to know. You two really ought to get together.
Mm-hmm.
Which is a similar thing you were doing.
Yeah. Tom asked a question that Ed touched on a little bit, which is we're seeing so much information, or there may be information on a government website that is later contradicted by something else, and people are weighing, how do you dissect whether something is true or not, what to believe? So Tom, he was the first one out of the gate to ask that question, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about resources, tools, ways that we as readers or as consumers of information can assess what is real, what is not, and then if you can overlay on that every one of us here is busy with family, jobs, just kind of trying to survive day by day in this pandemic. How do we invest the time wisely or smartly to be able to do that? Because you read one story and you might have questions about 5 things in a story. And may not have the time to go chase down everything. So if you can just talk about how you might advise, members of your own family on how to be a smart consumer of information.
Yeah, I look at what's the reputation and the history of the source. So you know, we know that we've had a lot of new news sources pop up in the last decade or so, whether it's you know, things that are looking for clickbait. I don't know why it's not coming to mind to me right now, but just, you know, some of the sort of more pop culture oriented sources of news. And yet we find that when there's a disaster or when there's something of significance that happens, people return to the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, you know, NPR as sources that they rely on. So I think you know, it's just a question of also not taking things at face value. You know, always looking deeper. So it often, you know, we tell students if something comes up on your Facebook feed, and is it making you feel a certain way, or something seem like maybe too salacious about this or whatever, you know, before you share it with someone else, look a little deeper, you know, check a couple of other sources to determine, you know, whether or not if it doesn't sort of meet that test, that something, you know, it may be designed to stir up some kind of emotion or something, you know. So
The area right now that I think is different in many counties is COVID and what is being reported out of the county health department and so forth. And I know our editor here has had to fight with our county public health official and for certain information. And I gather from my cousin who is up in Pendleton at our paper there that it's somewhat worse there. The one elected official that reliably is the key to so many things in a county is the district attorney. And we've, in various papers, we've had various versions of that. We had one here for years who was very informative, kept us apprised, explained things to us and so forth. Up in Pendleton, they had a district attorney for a long time who wouldn't talk beyond what he would say in the courtroom and so forth. And as you probably know, a DA has really more power than most mayors do. And so they're people who really have to be trusted or investigated, I guess you would say, if you don't take it with it, if you don't believe what they're saying, you better ask questions.
Mhm. So switching gears just a little bit, there was a question here. Aiden, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, asked a question about the end game as we look at the current state of media and all of these emerging things. But before we go there, I just wanted to touch on, we were talking about this a little bit earlier. I had recently seen, and maybe some of you had too, this sort of documentary drama called The Social Dilemma, which is on Netflix. And it talks about societal issues that have been exacerbated by social media and Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And in the documentary drama, there are former tech employees of these companies who are now sounding the alarm and saying, we are concerned about how these tools that we thought were used for good are now being used in these ways that are detrimental to our society, the way that we are getting information. And Ed, I'll start with you in talking about just the rapidly changing way that we are consuming information. So I loved, and I used to, even as a kid, get the newspaper with my family, and we'd all sit around at the breakfast table and we'd hand off sections to one another. I was in elementary school and I was doing that. Now we've got our phones and we're sort of scrolling through on Twitter or whatever we may be doing and getting some info that way. Can you talk about how you're seeing the use of social media affect in any way, or just what are your thoughts on whether social media is harming our ability to parse out information?
Well, first of all, the scenario that you just shared about families sitting around sharing a newspaper, if you're all on your devices, you're probably getting different feeds, even though so there are
the algorithm or
algorithms, yeah, that's the word I was looking for. The algorithms are designed to kind of feed you whatever they think is going to keep you on that platform for a longer period of time. So we're in the attention business of really trying to keep people and feeding them, like more of what they already agree with, more of what they already believe, and that becomes a problem because then we don't have any opportunity to kind of share ideas that may be unfamiliar to us if we're always just getting force fed what we already believe, and that's the problem. I don't know exactly what the escape from that is. I do find that some of my undergraduates are doing things that they're teaching me, like they're turning off, putting on do not disturb during certain periods and setting boundaries, because I think probably everybody here would agree to some degree more than they would like that these phones are there's an addictive quality to it. This notion of not having downtime or not being able to sit outside of a doctor's office and wait for the 15 minutes for them to call your name, that you've got to be scrolling and posting and doing whatever, just isn't it's not conducive to well-being. So I think at a certain point we're going to either see some class action suits. I got to tell you, as a parent with teenagers, the worst thing is Snapchat, because it gives kids the illusion that they can say and do anything and that it will disappear. And for middle schoolers, I've seen it firsthand where it's just disastrous. Kids saying and doing and sending pictures of body parts and all kinds of things that we would never that they would never do if they didn't suffer this illusion that that it wasn't going to potentially come back to haunt them. And that stuff doesn't just disappear; it's out there. So,
Very well said. The only thing I can add to that is a different dimension of the Facebook thing, but our reporters do use it as a reporting vehicle and as a way to find out what people know and what's going on. And we have a high Facebook readership quotient too, but that in the company, that's not my field. So
yeah, I've seen that in the last couple of days with Kellyanne Conway's daughter, who is on TikTok and reporting about her own family situation with COVID and having it. And reporters have said she is one of their most reliable sources. They'll get, you know, information from her via TikTok, a 60-second clip or whatever, versus sort of official statements from the White House. So Aiden asks, what is the end game with the current state of media? We've got traditional media, new media, social media, as well as society's relationship with media. It seems like the rate of change in new media, especially, is accelerating. And as usual, human adaptation moves slower than technological speed. So are we in a new normal? Has the pendulum swung to an extreme? And will it eventually return to normal, which is in quote marks?
Well, we're seeing some interesting things happen. You know, hardcover book sales are back above digital book sales. We're seeing that, you know, the tablets in terms of iPads and things like that sort of peaked in sales. We're seeing people, although because of COVID we can't, but there's still the desire to browse and, you know, a bookstore or be out with people or go to a coffee shop and things like that. You know, I mean, for most of us, I think we would probably agree, like, it's like being on Zoom all day is tiring. There's this level that, yeah, you laugh, but you know what I mean?
That's true. It's true.
Exhausting. It's exhausting. I don't necessarily know why, but, you know, we think it would be simpler because we're not having the park and, you know, and all that kind of stuff, but it's exhausting. And so, you know, I put trust in humanity. I think that we're going to continue to set boundaries for these platforms and these devices in terms of not just having unfettered access in ways that can do harm that we're still beginning to realize.
Well, there's sort of, I'd come at this in two ways. Media in Oregon is in flux. We have the decline of the Oregonian. We have the virtual disappearance of the Register Guard. Bend was on the precipice, and we got a very lucky break and are running it as a newspaper. But around the state, there are papers in jeopardy. As one of the fellows said, Grants Pass apparently is in a end game situation. I did not know about that. The Voorhees family, I think, has been the owning family there for 100 or so years. And so some of us are going to stay around and do our communities. There will be news deserts. At the same time, I think there's a role for philanthropy, perhaps. We want to explore as a company the concept of a fund for rural journalism, the kinds of newspapers that they're the kind of markets that just will not grow. And so it's very difficult to sustain them. We're intrigued with that concept. Something Ed alluded to in a prior conversation, but not this one, I think, is that I think, and I've long preached this, is that there is an avenue for graduates of the U of O J School who have the moxie to go out and start community news sources. As soon as the day that what we're all looking at on our laptops, the day these happen, you no longer needed a printing press to create a news source. And if you need the press these days, you don't own it, you don't have it out back. You pay someone else to print your paper. It can be done. The best situation, of course, is a partnership of two or more people who want to do this, and they need to raise capital. But the technology aids that enormously. We see people flirt with that in places like this. They tend to be ideologically driven about setting up their quote news site, but no one is doing it in a solid way, and that's another element. But as to what we will end up using as news sources, I dare say, in a decade, within Oregon, it will have shifted again. I was in on the startup of Willamette Week in '73. I was one of the 5 people that started Willamette Week. So I stay in touch. And Richard Meeker, who's the principal owner of Willamette Week, told me recently that he's gotten information now that they're putting as many papers into the heart of Portland as the Oregonian is. And if you had told me that in '73, I would not have believed you. And if you look at the one thing I tell people in Portland, at least, is get on their subscriber list. Their feed every day is very interesting. And get on theirs and get our statewide newsletter out of Salem, Oregon Capital Insider. And you've got 2 elements of what's going on. So we're in shift. We're in other ownerships, may not survive all of this. You can survive. I will tell you that. It's not I get tired of the national narrative, which indicates or implies that we all must die out here, and we don't need to. There's a way to keep going. And technology is so much, and it's not just the technology we've been talking about here, but it's the technology that allows you to track your sales, and it allows you to track the demography of the market you're trying to sell into, and all of that. And so if you've got access to that, you can win.
One of the things you mentioned sort of about solutions that you might be exploring, or maybe other publications in the state, is a model that I've seen happen in Chicago, which is philanthropic organizations contributing to news organizations, and news organizations looking to shift to a more nonprofit model to be able to survive and keep going and pull in this money. And then probably a couple months ago, there was a fundraiser where all of these very small publications banded together and had a fundraiser. So if you donated, what they ended up doing was splitting the funds. And I don't know, I think it was Carolyn who asked this question about how do we help these publications that are in jeopardy. And it may be, as senior fellows, worth looking at, models in other parts of the country, and then talking with some of the fellows in our organization who are, at philanthropic places now, to figure out, what are you talking about? How are you thinking about this too? That's something that I've just seen recently.
Yeah, I was amazed. Willamette Week has a button. You'll see it on their website. Help support whatever they say, local journalism. And Meeker told me, I've forgotten, I'm going to get this wrong, but it was in excess of 10,000 donors who were making monthly donations to them. Now, they of course don't have any they don't have a subscriber base, which our papers do, so they lack that revenue stream. But that's a remarkable number, and we have that button on our sites as well, and we've gotten modest amounts. But as I mentioned, we're going to approach one of the foundations with this concept of a fund for rural journalism. My classmate Linda Shelk chatted and said, "Tell us." I left out another component, a publication we've created. It's called The Other Oregon, and again, you can subscribe. It's for free, and it's all about rural Oregon, and it's written for the urbanite to see about what's going on in places like Vail and Pendleton and Grant County and Klamath County and so forth. It's a lot of it is about economics, but it's also about culture too, I guess I would say.
I see this a lot in supporting local news. People will say, subscribe, actually pay for your news. Pick a couple of news organizations and be a paying member to get that information, because we've so shifted to this model where we expect it to be free. People want to step around the paywalls and things like that. Is there anything else Ed, that you think is another way to support local journalism?
Way to support local journalism.
Mm-hmm.
Subscriptions, I guess. There's another issue related to this that I think that trails back to the whole topic of trust in journalism, and that has to do with just kind of the way the profession shifted, sort of the professionalization of journalism that sort of created a situation where people who were journalists or were pursuing journalism sought to like kind of move from like a smaller market to a larger market to a larger market on in terms of building their own career, and therefore not staying in any one place too long and not building engendering trust within that community, really understanding that community in the way that beat reporters may have 50, 60 years ago. And so I think that's also one of the factors in the trust issue, that sometimes people, they read something and they can sort of intuitively tell that the person who wrote it or is covering it doesn't know as much about the community as they do, because they live there. So I think that's also a factor. So it's a two-way street.
That's a very good point, Ed. And that is shifting as well, at least from what we can observe. In the old days, a reporter here would aspire to go to the Register Guard, and one of them did, and she's still there, I think. But there aren't many openings there. And then Bend would rate us considerably. Now Bend is part of our company, so we don't worry about that, so to speak. But one of the aspects of COVID is that people aren't going anywhere, and we have a reporter here. Our reporters tend to be young, as in 20s, 30s, and he's a fantastic business reporter and handles other things as well. And we offered him the opportunity to go to our paper in Wallowa County because we need a little stability up there. And for a certain kind of person, Wallowa County would be heaven. I guess it's not for him. So he's chosen to stay here, which is just fine because he's the kind of guy you're talking about, Ed, which is he's been with us now for, gee whiz, 8 years maybe. So he really knows the town and people know him and so forth. But it's another example the other direction. Cassandra Profita, who's now with OPB, was a terrific environmental reporter for us. And in those days, I knew, okay, we've got Cassandra for maybe 2 years, maybe 3. And I think because of the recession during which she tried to leave for Michigan, and her offer evaporated, she stayed for we got another year or 2 out of her. That was atypical. But in the old days, if you had someone, who was really bright and impressive, they'd be gone in 2 or if you keep them for 3 years and you've done well, but not now. They're staying longer.
So to shift gears a little bit, this is something that came up personally for me when I was entering the Oregonian, and it was sort of this understanding of me and how I identified stepping into this place that was a largely white newsroom. And just before I go a little bit further with that story, one of the things that the Pew report said is that it started breaking out by race, different communities and how their perception of news is. So one of the things that they called out, which I'll read to you, is they said, Black adults are far more likely than others to say it's important to see themselves both in news coverage and in the newsroom, which by way of trust. And I think I saw in here, we had a mention, maybe it was Vicky who reads the Scanner News, that there are publications that are dedicated to reporting about different communities, whether it's Black communities, rural communities. So when I was entering the Oregonian, we talked a lot about newsroom diversity, but what I noticed over my time there is that the newsroom got wider. That was one thing. That education also played a role in it, and then also class, if you can attach that to it, where most people were required to have at least a bachelor's degree. A lot of my colleagues and friends had master's degrees. I didn't, but they did. And And it played a role in who was in the newsroom, by way of sort of hiring priorities or what they were looking for, but then also what was covered. When I was there, I think we had one native Spanish speaker, and one person that I can remember who spoke Korean. So, just, it was like you can count people on their hands in terms of languages spoken or experiences. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, as you think about the media landscape, about who are telling these stories across Oregon, how newsroom, the makeup of newsrooms, the people who are there making editorial decisions and whatnot, how that might affect the trust of readers or news consumers across the state.
Who's first?
Either one of you could take this on. Is just what are your observations of this?
Well, we talked about this before we started up a little bit, and there are two things you said that I think really do. They obviously ring true, but they're important as well. And one is that people need to see themselves in the paper. If you are ignoring a segment of your population, by my lights, you're stupid. But that I don't know how you describe it otherwise. But it's, and I mentioned earlier, I think, the Hispanic population over here, which again is not as large as it is in Umatilla County, for instance. And of course, the minute you start covering them in a way that is forthright and, shall we say, honest, you inevitably run into the wall of racism and resentment among some of your readers, who will put their names on it even and say, why are you paying attention to those people, etc. So that is one aspect. We are not very diverse newsrooms in our company. We've had one African-American reporter here and one in Pendleton. In Pendleton, I believe one year there was a Native American reporting fellowship. So they were able to take advantage, which is important. If you know Pendleton, you know Umatilla County. It's the confederated tribes of the Umatilla, Cayuse, and Nez Perce are there. And the paper's always been good at recovering them. Very interestingly, we did a survey a long time ago and asking, what is it you as a reader, want to know about? And of course, guess what? The white readership did not care very much about what was going on with the reservation. Now, it's very poetic, because if you know much about that tribe, it's a very, very smart tribe, and it is an economically vital tribe. And these days, if you need money for something, you go to the tribe. Mm. They have their own foundation, and they have bought up a lot of things and so forth. But that is, and then back to the language thing, and we spoke about this earlier in our sort of pregame thing, is we had a reporter here a number of years ago, and she was white, and she was the kind of person who was facile with languages. She had about 5 languages under her belt. So she uncovered on her own, she could talk to the Hispanic population here, and we learned things that we simply would not have known, and they led to important news stories. Mm-hmm. So the language thing is a huge thing, and in Pendleton these days they are equipped, I believe.
I think part of it also has to do with introducing, students from diverse backgrounds to journalism, and encouraging them to pursue, that as a pathway. I, in addition to my role as an associate professor at the School of Journalism, I also run a nonprofit called the Journalistic Learning Initiative, and we do a lot of work in middle and high schools throughout Oregon and California. And specifically targeting students in underrepresented and underserved communities. And so, we have any number of projects that provide opportunities for kids to explore and experience journalism, and to consider it as a career pathway.
So one of the things, we're at one now. I know that some people are dropping off or going to other Zoom meetings, the dreaded Zoom meeting. But I wanted to see, we have the opportunity, if we are interested in breaking up into groups and going into a deeper dive with a smaller group of people. So that's an option. Or if this group wants, we can just continue all together with Steve and Ed to talk. And I don't know if anybody, if you want to just drop in the chat, or if anybody just wants to raise their hand and unmute to say what their preference is. I just want to mention that because one, some of you may also have to leave, but if you want a smaller discussion about some of these things, we're also open to that too. Beth prefers to stay together. Tom, what say you?
Well, I would like to see us all stay together, and if it's, I'd like to pose a question to Steve that he can answer after we get through with this. But as some of you know, I grew up on a very large family farm in the Willamette Valley. I was actually 5th generation. And Steve's family used to have a publication called the Capital Press. I assume you still do.
Still do.
One of the things that's always been frustrating to me as a farm kid is that agriculture and the timber industry are two of the dominant industries in where almost every one of us does not live. And communicating within those communities is critical. And the Capital Press, especially when I worked for Goldschmidt, was a must read for us to try to understand what was going on. And Steve and Ed also, how much information is available still on agriculture, and are there other people that recognize the value and the importance to the vast majority geographically of the people in the state of Oregon?
Well, we do still own the Capital Press, and it's a phenomenal information resource. The interesting thing to me is that the largest audience is, of course, farmers. However, there are also a number of other groups that take it, including some environmental groups, because it's the only place they can find certain information. And but I mentioned earlier the Other Oregon, and we started the Other Oregon for the reasons you're talking about, Tom. Is it's not strictly speaking about agriculture, although, as you would imagine, since it's about rural Oregon, a lot of it is agricultural, and all about the link between that and the urban markets that they sell to. And so we started it for that reason. And if you're not on that subscription list, Tom, you should be.
So I have a question come in. Connie, I see your hand. I'm going to go first to Jeff. Jeff, if you can unmute and just tell us what class you were in, and then ask your question.
Jeff Golden, class 3, and I actually have 2 classmates on this call, which is unusual. Steve, great to see you after many, many, many years. I want to follow up on something you said earlier that I think's critically important. You said first you decide what to cover and then how to cover it. And this, to me, is the great unaddressed piece in the argument about media bias, because by and large, people on the left, if we can use crude labels, think the media is right slanted and vice versa. And it seems to me the biggest reason for that is that people on the right tend to focus on things like the political registration, the party registration of journalists. And people on the left, at least some of them, I think correctly, put a lot more emphasis on story assignment and story selection. And, you know, to me, some of the most important stories trace the flow of power and money in society in a way that's generally pretty dry, except for, you know, the folks who are fanatical about these things. I'd point to Democracy Now! as an example. And I think the reason that that's not much of that is covered is less ideological. It's, you know, I have some alignment with the view that corporate media doesn't want some of that it's very hard to pursue those stories in a way, you know, that fits short attention spans. And I don't want to be too cynical about the attention spans of readers, but it strikes me that it's going to be hard to commercially succeed if you do stories like Amy Goodman does. And I pick her fairly arbitrarily. Stories about corporate power, stories about the flow of money, investigative journalism. It's expensive to do and probably doesn't pay off in terms of the revenue, which makes me wonder about, you know, the limits of what commercial media can do in the context of the investigative journalism that I think we need and are lacking. So I wonder if you'd speak to that a little bit more and what you see as the possibility that commercial media can cover more of those stories that take some attention and focus from their audience.
Well, you can do those, not the, I would say, not the exhaustive sort of thing that you might find in Harper's or the Atlantic, for lots of reasons. You've got a much different readership, for one thing. Our readership they're geographically based. They're not ideologically based. But having said that, one example of kind of what you're talking about is the largest single swath of forest land in Clatsop County, which is one of Oregon's, we're right in the middle of the temperate North American rainforest. It's big, and it's ownership, and it really describes the sort of path of money in America. You know, for years it was Crown Zellerbach, and then it became that Raider Cavanum, and then Weyerhaeuser got it. Willamette Industries had it for a while. Those were great days because Willamette Industries, as you know, was a decidedly different kind of a forest products company. Well, guess who owns it today? Money managers. And to their credit, they talk, and they don't hide behind that. I give them credit, and they will tell us about their forestry and so forth. So just in our little local scale, that has been an interesting thing where the global does really, you know, intrude or poke into it. And of course, you see it in retail. That's a standard story, you know, the big boxes showing up and challenging the locals and so forth. And with COVID right now, it's driving to the paper this morning, out of the corner of my eye, I realized the major art gallery in town seems to be, its walls are bare. That overnight they've gone away. Our reporters are checking that out. You know, the COVID thing it's on the local level, you know, it's been very interesting. I early on during COVID, I did interviews with 5 chef proprietors, and then with 5 small business owners, family owners, and these were very emotional experiences with these folks. And you know, you're not going to find that obviously in the national press, except very occasionally. But the global is here. We like to advertise we're a local paper with a global outlook. And of course, if you know the history of Astoria and Clatsop County, it always has been. This particular place has been at times, you know, the center of the political universe during that period of time. But that's getting a little far afield. Good to see you, Jeff.
You too, Steve. Could I follow up really quickly? I know
Yeah.
Let me just sneak one more thing in. When people say to you, I want to do what I can to reform media, reforming media is my thing, my issue, what do you suggest? Where do you think the most leverage or power is for a more thoughtful helpful media for those of us trying to be good citizens? Where's the juice in media reform, do you think? And I like Ed's thought on that too.
Well, I'm curious, what do you mean when you say reform media? What?
Well, it speaks to a little bit to what I was talking to before about what the kinds of stories you see, trying to get more substantive content about policy and power and less political horse racing and glamour stories.
Well, here's what I find kind of interesting. If you travel internationally and you turn on CNN International, it's an entirely different, we Americans, either by corporate edict or by polls or something, it's been decided that we have no interest in what's going on around the world. And so we're pretty ignorant when it comes to knowing who the leaders are of other countries. But if you watch CNN International, you see, reporting on what's going on all around the world, Turkey, Africa, and I think it's a shame. I think it's actually, it speaks to why we can have so much emphasis on what the Kardashians are doing or whatever else, and not really be focused on substantive issues. Also, you talk about Amy Goodwin, and you're just not going to see Noam Chomsky or people who are considered brilliant, but yet fringe by mainstream standards. You're not going to see them on NBC Nightly News or even on MSNBC for that matter. There is definitely sort of a status quo that exists at the higher levels of mainstream media about what really gets to be considered diverse perspective. And it has to do with our two-party system. You're not going to see Green Party candidates given any level of seriousness. I think Marianne Williamson had, got more coverage, but it was all about, being a guru or whatever, and and not really taking her seriously. So I think it speaks to, who's paying the bills, and it's major corporations, and so there is sort of a check within a system there that doesn't allow for real divergence from what you might expect otherwise.
Do you see any promising reform efforts?
Well, I think the weeklies, the alt weeklies. Willamette Week is an example, just in the Pulitzers that they've won and how they were relentless in their coverage of the Kitzhaber issue, and they really did work that the Oregonian didn't, and so we have spaces within journalism where because as Steve said, you don't have to have a huge printing press in your, that you walk out to get a paper out, that there's ways to get information out there, and I think that people like yourself are going to respond to good reporting, and it may not be the largest of audiences, but there are people paying attention in ways that they couldn't before, because there were the significant gatekeepers that guarded, kind of the whole process of what got covered and to what degree it got covered. But I don't know. It's a tough topic. I do think that one thing that's reassuring is that we're finding that in terms of like at the University of Oregon, our numbers are not going down. People, in many ways, it seems like there's a call. They say journalism is a calling. And there are a number of young people who look at what's going on and they feel they want to be a part of shining light on things that some people would rather they not. The question is that when it comes to having the legal team of a New York Times, or a Washington Post that can withstand the pushback. When you speak truth to power, you got to be prepared that it's going to try to hammer back, and that's one of the problems with startups and smaller news operations that don't have the same deep pockets as some of the institutional giants out there.
Ed is right about the quality of the students that U of O has. They run a program out of there called the Snowden Internship Program, named for a guy who was a copy editor at the Oregon Journal, whose family put up the money for it. It's a very simple concept. We get a reporter for the summer. We pay half the salary, and the program pays half the salary. And I don't know how long it's been going, Ed. Is it 10, 15, 20 years
At
old?
least that long, yeah.
Yeah. And we've benefited from this all that period of time. And now most of our papers are using it. And really bright young reporters, and many of whom we subsequently hire. But I would, the only thing I would add is, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, I think what we need is a new generation of media entrepreneurs, young media entrepreneurs, and who will go out and start new ventures. It's one thing to conceptualize something, and it's quite another to go out and do it. And I don't know that the extent to which you can teach it. It has to be in someone's, when we started Willamette, people thought we were crazy. And we were. we were in our 20s and we were crazy. But here it is today,
I wanted to go to Connie next. Connie, if your question hasn't been answered, go ahead and unmute and let us know what class you were in too.
I was in class 13, and it wasn't an unlucky class. It was a very good class. Alf, for my observation of watching all these years and being a part of it, is there's always been this looking at the other Oregon. So I'm glad there's a publication about the other Oregon. I watch in Oregon, there's this consistently sporadic concern about the other Oregon, the rural, urban. And I watch as I work with community colleges. So I've gotten to live in Tillamook, I've gotten to live in Pendleton, and I also have lived in Salem. So you get to see a lot of different ways of how people approach things. And you begin to see how papers, after living in Pendleton and Tillamook, those papers hold a lot of the glue of the communities together. It's different on the I-5 corridor. So I'm curious, as we go forward, and we know there's this other Oregon, just like I love international CNN, because it lets you see the rest of the world. How do we use social media and media presence to help us care about the other Oregon, the rest of the world? There is this piece where we seem to get in our silos, and I am just curious whether it's the entrepreneurs, Steve, you're suggesting encourage entrepreneurship in media, but it seems like so much of the world is in your social channel or in your silo of friends, and those robust conversations that I remember growing up, even at my family table, they don't exist the same way. And yet it's all of us in this together. So I'm just curious, as you've done the other Oregonian, and as you watch journalism, how do we actually support this view beyond ourself, which is, I think, is one of the things that media does, but I think it's harder and harder to do the view beyond yourself. So I'm curious what you've learned from the other Oregon that you're published, that you have. I'm also curious, Ed, as you watch students come in, their curiosity, do they see the excitement of the other point of view, not to have it be put down, but to value the other point of view? I see Susan on here, and Susan, I remember working with the State Board of Ed, and Lou was on the State Board of Ed too, and there's lots of other views, but those other view conversations are harder and harder to see and harder to report on. And I don't think collaboration and agreeing to disagree is even valued the same way. And media is a way to encourage that. So it's more about this bigger, how do we get people to see the other view, the other Oregon? Pick whichever, watch international CNN if you can find it, right, Ed?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do we do?
Well, the only thing I will offer to reinforce what you just said is that I have found that a lot of Oregonians in the urban area, and I lived in Portland for 10 years, lived in DC for 10 years, are very, what I would call, geographically illiterate. And I can't tell you how many times we've had this conversation. I grew up in Pendleton, and so people are curious about, they've heard about the Pendleton Roundup. And people will say, I've always wanted to go to Pendleton, like they're talking about France. And I said, all you do is get on I-5 or I-84 and, and head east, and don't stop until you get there. And then Wallowa County is a whole other dimension beyond that. And if you want to go to an otherworldly place, it is Wallowa County. And what you will find if you get there and you live there for a while, I did that for 3 weeks, I filled in as editor, is it has the most fascinating population, Wallowa County does. And if you want to know about it, it's called the Wallowa County Chieftain. And I think it's the only newspaper in America with a Native American on the masthead, his picture. So it's a funny thing how people are so unaware of the rest of the place, but that's what the other organ is about. It's a very popular magazine. People like it a lot, and we've picked up, it's paying for itself now. We've picked up a number of sponsor advertisers, and so yeah. And the current issue has, the cover story is Jim Kelly, Rejuvenation House Parts out of Portland. He moved to Grant County. He's got a ranch out there. So he knows both worlds, and he talks about that. It's a good piece about him.
Thanks, Steve. Ed, ways we can help continue this to get outside our geographical boundaries? Good way to summarize it, Steve.
You're asking me?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, okay. Well, I think we've tossed around at the J School about creating some type of news service that would allow our students to be, in addition to the Snowden program, out in these communities and reporting in areas that are where there's they're underserved. I think it would be kind of neat to do. It's dependent on grant funding and support and things like that. But I think it does two things. First of all, it creates a level of affinity for young people to want to not necessarily always jump and go to the big city, but really, be a part of these communities. But also it would provide sort of a lifeline, to be able to hear stories that we don't typically hear. I mean, I think that was one of the real, messages from the 2016 election, is that there are a lot of people in rural areas who feel like their interests aren't expressed, or either ignored, or even worse, dismissed. And so, as a profession, we got to do more to make sure that, a wider range of voices are heard.
Thank you.
Something Ed said earlier is worth, in terms of the question you've just been asking. OPB is our only statewide news service right now, or news source, news medium, whatever you want to call it. And they have a large reporting force. And so, if you want to have an impact, I would say figure out who is who within that vast news enterprise that is now OPB. We friend a lot of their product, of their news product in our papers. I don't listen to the radio station as much as I used to. So I'm not sure really how it comes out, but that's one way, because they're a nonprofit and they have to be accessible and so forth.
Thank you.
So we are going to go to Lou, who had a question. It's probably going to be our last question as we're approaching time. But Lou, go ahead.
Well, I want to thank you. I want to thank Steve and Ed for their comments. My concern, and I've got to say, it's because of my background. The broadcast industry, you mentioned OPB, is it's good. Everyone will tell you, if you ask them in a survey what they listen to, they'll tell you that they listen to OPB. They are not. They are lying, but that's what they will say that they do. And so it's important to know that, because what I've seen is on a very basic level, the folks, again, in Portland really do not know what's going on in the rest of the state. They have no clue, and they don't have that clue because we've cut back on the media that actually goes out to the rest of the state. It's great Steve has continued to support the rest of the communities in the state, and the reporting out there is outstanding because he's connected with what's going on there. But we do not have that here in Portland at all. I have to deal with constituents telling me that they wanted to, one constituent wanted me to stop the dust machines along 97 from putting up so much dust when he was driving along there, because he couldn't understand what was going on. I had to explain to him that they were combines and it was a farm, but he really did not know that. He wanted legislation to stop it at a particular time. The Capitol coverage that we have, and I just have to say this, I'm glad that Steve's doing his best, but we no longer have bureaus in the basement for commercial television. No longer has bureaus in the basement of the Capitol. The assumption that we often have is the mythology is that we have TV and radio coverage coming out of the Capitol on a regular basis. That is not true. We have the television stations have abandoned the Capitol, and they will helicopter in when there's something that is printed in the Oregonian or the Willamette Week. I'm just curious about how we take that next step, both Ed and Steve. How do we begin to get the folks in the metropolitan areas to know what's going on in Coos Bay? What is it that we need to do that? Because at this point, we do not have that connection. It is broken. You're getting good information in some of those smaller cities, but we do not have it coming back into the metro area. And so folks have no clue. And as I said, they also have no clue about what's really going on in the metro area, because appropriately, the newspapers in those small cities are paying attention to what's going on in those small cities and relying on a really decimated media in the metro area to tell them what's going on. Any suggestions on that?
It's a conundrum. I mean, I think it's a matter of economics. Like, how does it get paid for? It's probably going to have to be some kind of foundation support or nonprofit model that's going to allow for that. But I don't know, Steve, what would you say?
Oh, I just have a couple of observations. When I was a columnist in Washington, D.C., I used to write a column where I would say that it's hard to see the rest of America from Washington, D.C. And the same thing is true, of course, of Portland. And I've developed this theory that all cities, all communities really, but cities especially, have these gravitational pulls on who lives there. And it's really hard to get outside that gravitational pull. And part of that, the influence of that gravitational pull is your attention and where you choose to focus it. And so, we've created this vehicle, the Other Oregon and so forth, for instance, but someone has to have the curiosity to want to read it. And I don't know how you instill that kind of curiosity in people about wanting to know about another part of the state if it's just not innate within them. The State House Bureau, that question that Lou raised, is we just need more of the kind of thing that we've put together now, and there are ways to do it. Sustaining it is over the long haul is what matters, that we keep it going for year after year.
You're correct, Steve. I mean, at one point in the 90s, we had 65 credentials for media in the Capitol.
Yeah.
Last year we had 15.
Yeah.
I mean, it has dropped so much, and I don't know how we rebuild the idea that you need to be paying attention to that, but we do need to figure out how to do it, because it encourages the kind of split and antagonism that I end up seeing when I'm dealing with other colleagues in the legislature, as well as just generally the people out there. So it's something we need to figure out how to address. We have not figured out how to do that yet.
Well, the point I made at the beginning when we started set up Oregon Capital Insider with Pamplin is that the corporate headquarters of Oregon's largest corporation is not out in Beaverton. It's in Salem. It's the biggest business in this state. Huge enterprise.
Yeah.
Touches every part of the state. And so that's why it matters. And I mean, that's the basis on which I think you sell it. It's one of the bases on which you sell it.
Well, I think
you're absolutely right about the TV, and it's so sad that they have just vanished from Salem.
Well, there's curiosity still about what's going on. It's just not fed. It doesn't feed the folks who are paying for broadcast media these days. Like they have that their loans are not paid if they are by way of just that curiosity, and just I'd love to figure out how we tap into that curiosity once again.
Yeah,
for what it's worth.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Steve. So we are a little bit past time now. I know that I had thought that we would close with a question that I think all of us are asking ourselves, and when we think about different policy issues in the state, senior fellows are asking is, how do we as a network, how do we as individuals sort of make a difference in name the issue in our state? And I don't know, Lisa, and thoughts on time, whether it's, whether we do that now or whether we figure out a forum for us to be able to follow up afterwards to just throw some things in. I threw something in the chat, a program that I see in Chicago that recruits and trains people to actually cover government meetings. What Lou said is very true. When I worked in the governor's office, you'd go into that basement newsroom and there would be nobody there. At one point when I was there, I was talking with an AP reporter. There were 2 people for the Associated Press covering the state of Oregon. And so we certainly have a shrinking media market in the state that's affecting all of us. It affects, our ability to participate in this democracy when we don't know what's going on. And it's harder as an individual to do. And when I was working in the governor's office, I'd walk into the state capitol. I thought that I knew everything that was going to go on in a certain particular day. And by the end of the day, was completely surprised about the latest little turn of the screw developments that actually had big ramifications. And I'm a reporter and still didn't know of these things. And I just imagine that folks living in all parts of the state who are relying on news sources who don't get to committee hearing meetings or things like that, that don't know what's going on. So I think it's a good question for us to tackle as a group and for people who are interested. Jeff mentioned that it's a big thing that's on his plate about figuring out how do we do something about this. And I know that Connie asked the same question. So Lisa, if that sounds okay with you, maybe we close out, but have some space for us to figure out how this conversation can continue with Steve and Ed, also, and their expertise. So in closing, I want all of us, if we can just, silently clap for Kelly and for Melissa and for Lisa, for bringing us together in community with one another, for allowing someone who's not in the state right now to be able to participate with my, senior fellows, fellow senior fellows. And we're just appreciative of everyone's time and investing in this conversation. So anything, Lisa, that you want to close with?
Yes, just 2 quick things. First, just the most deep gratitude to the 3 of you. What an incredible conversation. I myself just feel better prepared, I think, to consume news a little bit differently and to be more open to things that are outside of my current bubble, which is very comfortable. So thank you for that. It's a good encouragement for me. The second thing is, Vicki had asked about all of the resources that people were sharing in the chat. We've saved them all. So we'll send an email out to everybody who was on this call. So you'll have links to all of the resources that each of us shared with one another. And then just once again, thank you to Kelly and Melissa. programming that we're putting together is really responsive to what we're hearing from senior fellows. So you're going to get a survey today. And one of the questions in that survey will be, what other topics are you interested in us tackling? And as I said earlier, we have an incredible network of people in our senior fellow network. So think a little bit about what you want to learn more about, and we will find people within our network to help us all learn together. So thank you. Thank you all for taking the time to be here.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
All right,
Bye.
thank you.
Everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you,
Bye.
Steve. Thank you, Melissa.